Okay, the last video in this series on populations and ecosystems is to look at the process of succession. Now, the process of succession is the development of a complex community over time, from what is initially either bare rock or a much simpler community. So we're going to start by looking at primary succession. Now, primary succession, as shown in this picture, starts off with bare rock, which has not very hospitable for most organisms, and pretty much the only organisms that can live on bare rock are lichens or algae, and they are what we call the pioneer species. They are the first organisms that can live in that area. So in this particular picture it's shown as lichen, but it could be algae. Now, the beauty of this is that the pioneer species will inhabit the area, the rock, and by inhabiting the area, they will change the abiotic factors of that area. So, for example, they will break up the rocks to develop some soil. When they die, they will add minerals to create humus. And this will start to develop a little bit of a layer of soil. And that little bit layer of soil will allow the next species, the small plants, to start to colonize the area, and they will outcompete the pioneer species. So in effect, the pioneer species is changing the abiotic factors in such a way that it is no longer going to live there. So if you were to look at a graph of what is happening over time, you would see that they would slowly disappear. This same thing happens again and again. So the annual plants and still some lichens will then change the abiotic factors again so that grasses can come in, which will change the abiotic factors again so that shrubs, etc., can come in, which will change it again so that larger plants can come in, until eventually you reach your climax community, which is a woodland of some description. So to show you what I mean, if you have a look at this graph down here, you start off with the beginning, there's only bare rock, then your first organisms come in, and the bare rock will obviously decrease. The first organisms change the abiotic factors so that the grasses and perennials can come in, and therefore the mosses will decrease in number because they're out-competed, and so on, all the way until you get to your climax community. So when you are describing succession, the first thing you need to start with is your pioneer species. And in an exam question, you may have to identify what that is from a graph or a table. So it colonizes the bare rock, changing the abiotic factors. And I'm going to give examples because remember, in exam questions, we always want to try and be specific with examples. So breaks up the rock to form soil, or adds humus, which is dead and decaying matter. That leads, as we said, to your next species. I won't name it because it will depend, but it could be something like mosses. Will now colonize and outcompete, and that's a really important term. I'm going to underline it. Outcompete the pioneer. Again, it will change the abiotic factors. E.g. the pH of the soil, mineral content, whatever it happens to be. And then this process is repeated by more complex organisms until finally you get to your climax community, which is a woodland. Normally, it doesn't have to be, but it could stop somewhere earlier. But the important thing about a climax community is that it is stable. It does not change. Okay. It's often woodland, but you would have to look at the exam questions. Sometimes it might not be. So as we go through our succession, you will notice, as I said, that the organisms get more complex. They also have a bigger biomass. You have a bigger variety of habitats. And therefore, you get more biodiversity as you go through your communities until you get to your climax community. So through succession, they get more complex, they have a bigger biomass, we get a more variety of habitats because we've got under the soil, we've got top of the soil, we've got in the bark, we've got just in the actual canopy of the trees, etc. And therefore you'll have more biodiversity because you've got more habitats, more variety of foods, more variety of organisms and species that will live there. Now, in terms of a sort of quick definition of succession, which I am going to give you, because sometimes they ask for like a 2-mark succession definition, you will describe it as the development over time of more complex communities due to species changing the abiotic factors and out competing each other. It develops from pioneer to climax community. Now, the last thing to think about is something called secondary succession. So secondary succession is just the idea that we've had a climax community. So we had a woodland, for example, and then for some reason that woodland burnt down. So we go back to my original picture. If for some reason this woodland burnt down, so some sort of forest fire, for example, or some sort of destruction, that brought it back. Well, it's not going to take it all the way back to bare rock, but it's going to take it back, say, to our grasslands. And then we leave that grassland to go through succession a second time. That is called secondary succession. And the succession is pretty much similar, but you're already starting with your grassland, so you've sort of got your pioneer species already there. And often the climax community you get is just ever so slightly different in terms of the spread of the trees, but the principles are identical. And that is it in terms of succession. What you have to do in an exam question is read it carefully, because they will ask you to interpret what you can see in a graph or a picture in terms of succession. So identify the pioneer, identify the climax, then talk about the outcome competition and talk about the changing abiotic factors. Those are the main things that you need to be thinking about.